Have you ever wondered why so many strong theses or dissertations never turn into a single publication? Do you worry that once you finish your project, it'll only go to collect dust on a shelf? Hey, co-authors. In this episode, we reframe theses or dissertation projects from being a standalone document to viewing them as a portfolio of publishable work waiting to be refocused. We walk through systems that you need to put in place from the beginning to make sure that your work is publication ready. So let's dive in. So if you've been listening to the past 9 episodes on developing a thesis or dissertation, then you might have noticed a recurring pattern, which is that I often had disagreements with my advisor on how to proceed forward with my dissertation. And this episode will be no different. So whenever I was developing my dissertation, my advisor imagined that my final project was going to be a monograph. It was going to be a book. And they really thought, and I don't know why they thought this. I don't know why they were so gung-ho about doing it as a book. My discipline doesn't really privilege books, at least not in my part of the field. Like for the most part, everyone does journal articles. So that was a little bit weird. But also the type of work that I wanted to do for my career was very article focused. And so I kept wanting to do things as articles. They kept wanting to do things as books. And so the entire structure and organization of the dissertation from the very beginning was a battle because we didn't see eye to eye on what was the product that was going to come out of this post-defense. So if you were working on your thesis or dissertation, what I would say is that it's very important for you to see eye to eye with your advisor, and it helps. And so for some folks, they create their dissertations very explicitly as being able to be converted a monograph quite easily. Other folks, they take that more traditional dissertation structure, but it does kind of lend itself still to that book monograph sort of form. Other folks, they'll have a dissertation where all it is just articles that they are submitting or have published, or they might have that more traditional thesis or dissertation 5-chapter structure, in which case you're having to sort of like jump around in order for you to be able to get what you need for your journal articles. For me, based on the experience that I've had over the past nearly 15 years of publishing, I want to focus more on how to develop your dissertation into journal articles. I will have episodes coming up about how to put together book proposals. And I think that a lot of that work is going to be applicable to this type of process. So I want to focus on what I think is a larger leap, which is going from a traditional 5-chapter thesis or dissertation and then taking that and then putting that into articles for peer-reviewed journals. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how to take your thesis or your dissertation and put them into your publication pipeline. So let's dive in.
Are you interested in mastering scholarly writing, developing productivity, and increasing impact, all while staying healthy? Then welcome to the Publishing Academic Research Podcast. My name is Dr. Kyle Ruddick, and I'm a full professor and writing coach who's dedicated to making sure you break through whatever is stopping you from reaching your scholarly goals. I meet so many scholars who have creative, innovative, and daring ideas, but can never seem to get those projects from proposals to print. I want you to get your work in the hands of people who will read it and appreciate it. So let's get into this week's big idea.
So the first thing I'll say is whenever I'm reviewing for conferences or journals, it is oftentimes very apparent whenever something comes in and it is based on someone's thesis or dissertation. And that is not a good thing. Yeah, I should not be able to tell that. But there are some pretty telltale signs that that is the case. One, and most egregiously, I've had people just take their 10, 12, 13,000 words, which is much longer than what we normally allow. Usually our word limits are like 8,000 or 9,000 words. So you have something that's far longer than what the normal limit is anyway. And it might even still have all of the headings that's based on the grad college, not on APA or MLA. It might even say chapter in there, but they've just taken the chapter and then they just submitted it somewhere. That is not what you should be doing. Your dissertation or your thesis has been created with a very explicit audience in mind. That audience is your committee. That is who you are trying to write to with your dissertation or your thesis. Yes, other people might read it. Yes, it goes to the grad college. Yes, it might be archived somewhere. But at the end of the day, the only people who really, truly matter whenever it comes to your thesis or your dissertation is your committee. That's it. So whenever you're taking that document and you just submit wholesale pieces out of that to other outlets, you are egregiously and grossly misinterpreting who your audience is. Because now your audience is not the 3 people that you've known for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Now it's faceless people who have different ideas about how to do scholarship, have different ideas about what your area looks like, all those different things, and you've just plopped this thing down in their lap, which is really a conversation that you've been having with other people, but now you're acting as if this other new audience should have been a part of that the entire time. What's going to happen, which is usually what happens whenever I review these things, is that they just get rejected, or they get paneled, very early in the morning or very late in the afternoon where no one's going to listen to them, because it's very obvious that you don't really have any respect for your audience. You've just taken this thing written for another group of people and you just threw that into the mix here. So the first thing that you have to realize is that thesis or dissertation chapter, any of the writing that's in there, you are never going to just take that and just throw it in as a journal article or a conference paper. That is very, very unlikely that you're ever going to be able to do that. So instead, you got to be thinking not about how am I going to take this and break it up into, you've got to get away from the idea of like, how am I going to take this project and break it up or shrink it into articles? But instead, how does my dissertation or thesis project give me the foundation by which I might start to write articles? And I think the first step to that is mental, which is to say that from the very beginning, whenever you're thinking about your thesis or your dissertation, you need to be thinking it in two different ways. One is your defense mindset. That is, how is my writing going to help me pass my defense? Because again, at the end of the day, if you don't graduate, none of this really matters, right? If you don't get your thesis done and go on to your PhD program, or if you don't get your dissertation done and go on to be a professor, if you never finish those projects, then none of this really matters. So the first thing you have to do is focus on this defense mindset. What is it that my committee wants? How do they want to see it? How am I going to address this in ways that preserves the integrity of my project while meeting the demands and rigors of my discipline and of my department? But also, from the very beginning, you should have a pipeline mindset. You should be thinking about how your project is going to be used as a foundation for future articles. And again, that needs to happen at the beginning of the project. So whenever you come up with your dissertation or thesis idea, you should be thinking to yourself, okay, is this an idea that can go into multiple journals? Or is this something that one journal in particular is going to like? Because if it's across multiple journals, cool, right? Whenever you get done, you might have multiple submissions that are in different outlets. But if there's only one or two outlets that are really looking at the type of work that you want to produce, well, you really shouldn't submit all of those at once. A, because you're probably not going to get good reviewers if you do that. But B, because it's not really good in terms of the longevity of you demonstrating your scholarly contributions to your field. Instead, you would want to submit pieces 1 or 2 a year until you had finished that particular conversation. And so as you're developing the idea for your thesis or your dissertation, you need to think to yourself what journals it is that you want to submit to, what types of conversations are they having, and how does your dissertation or thesis project connect to those things, and then how much do you need to publish as opposed to how much that you have, right? So if you have a very robust dissertation or thesis project, you might be able to spend 2, 3, 4, 5 different projects off of it. If you're in a more teaching-oriented job, then you might only want to publish 1 or 2 of those things a year, so that way you're not having to develop a whole new body of scholarship as you're trying to get your feet under you in your first job. On the other hand, if you're at an R1 or another type of research-intensive position, then maybe you use your entire dissertation developing your first 2 years worth of scholarship or first year's worth of scholarship. And then after that, there's not really anything left to it that you will be able to use. It's important for you to think about what sort of trajectory that you're going to have post-defense and how this project, your thesis or your dissertation, are going to set you up for that. Otherwise, you might find yourself at the end, getting done with your defense, getting into that post-defense slump like we talked about in the last episode, and now all of a sudden you can't even think to ever get to your dissertation or your thesis again because you hate it, you hate the project, you hate talking about it, you hate thinking about it, and by the time that you're ready to come back to it, it's 2, 3, 4 years, and now all of your data is old, and now the project's useless to you. So what are the steps then of converting your thesis or your dissertation project into a journal article? Well, first I would say is that you need to identify what the contribution is. So as I've been saying, you need to make sure that you identify a journal or multiple journals that you think that your dissertation or your thesis topic would be appropriate for. And I say topic, but as I've said in previous episodes, the 3 ways that you can tell whether your work is appropriate for a journal or not is based on its theory, its method, and its topic of investigation. So theory, are the frameworks that you're using ones that appear in that journal frequently? Method, is it methodologically consistent with the journal? So if it's quantitative, are you doing quantitative work, qualitative, doing qualitative work, so on and so forth. And then topic, making sure that the area or the phenomenon or the issue that you're studying is one that appears in that journal in the past. All that is to say is that with those three things, that you might be looking at your thesis or your dissertation as having one or more connections to multiple journals. And that's how you should really think about it. If a journal has 3 out of 3, well, that's a really good fit. That's where you should submit first. 1 out of 3, well, maybe that's a little bit lower down your list. Maybe you start with the ones that have a better fit first, and then if it gets rejected, well, maybe I can go to this other journal. You really want to try to find outlets that hit as many of those 3 things as possible. And then from that, developing a list of journals that you think would be interested in those contributions. So once you found the appropriate outlets, next thing to do is to think about your literature review. Now, your literature review is 30, 40, 50 pages long, and it's a standalone chapter. Unfortunately, the vast majority of that work will not make its way into whatever article it is that you're writing. Most articles, if they're on the quantitative social science side, you might have 10, 12, 14 pages of the work that is literature review. If it's a qualitative research report, then you might be looking at something more like 6, 8, 10 pages. Because in qualitative research, it's usually more inductive logic than deductive logic. All that is to say that whenever you have 30, 40, or 50 pages of literature review, now you're going to have to narrow that down. And a part of this is, who is your audience? Whenever your audience was your thesis or your dissertation committee, your audience's primary rubric for them understanding whether you should pass or not was, did you do an exhaustive literature review? Did you do enough work to demonstrate that you touched all the things that are going on in your project? Or you might even have had a whole bunch of variables or a whole bunch of frameworks in your literature review. Well, you don't have that time in an article. Your article is usually 8 to 9, maybe 10,000 words. You don't have the space for all of that stuff to appear. And so whenever you're thinking about your literature review, you should be thinking about it in terms of, what can I strip out of this in order for me to make 1, 2, 3, 4, however many articles. And that literature review then is going to be far more specific and far more pointed. And I hate to say this, you might even have to do even more research after your thesis or your dissertation just to make sure that you have the stuff that's in your literature review that makes it very specific and very unique to that outlet, because otherwise it's going to read too general, it's going to read too abstract, because it's going to be written from a place of, I need to cover all of my bases, which is usually not the tone that most journals are looking for. The tone that most journals are looking for is, here is a specific problem, a specific contribution. And so you're going to have to really demonstrate that by parsing down your literature review. Now, your literature review, again, creates a foundation for that. It has the bibliography or references. It has a lot of the writing already done. But instead of thinking about it in terms of, how can I make my 40-page literature review an 8-page or 10-page literature review for an article? Instead, you should be thinking of it as, what in this writing provides the foundation for me to then write the 8 to 10-page literature review for my article. The next step then is to think about your methods. Again, whenever you're doing a methods section for a dissertation or a thesis, often your committee is going to ask for a lot of detail, because from our point of view, especially whenever you're a master's student, we think of you as a novice who is beginning the practice of your craft. It's very important to us that you are showing all of your work, that you're communicating every choice that you've made, in order for us as the committee to be satisfied that you know how to replicate that process for the rest of your career, because that's what we're setting you up to do. So that way you can continue to be a scholar in your PhD program or as a professor whenever you get your job. But whenever you're writing an article, what we are looking for in that case is not every single methodological choice you've made. Instead, we're looking at, can you give us enough information that we are confident that you engaged in a rigorous analysis? You should be really looking at the journal outlet and seeing, what does this outlet view as a rigorously done article? How is that communicated in the method? And how the work that I've done in my thesis or dissertation, how can I take that work, put it in this format? Or do I need to go back to my IRB and ask additional information from my participants or something else in order for me to make sure that I have everything available for this journal outlet. If you look at most theses or dissertations, a lot of their method sections are 5, 6, 7, 8 pages long, and you simply don't have that much space in a traditional article. Most articles have a method section that is a page to 3 pages in length. So you're taking your work and really condensing that down. So you need to make sure that you are figuring out what is it in this journal that they want to see in order for me to be able to communicate to them the rigor and carefulness that I've conducted through my investigation. The next step then is to look at your results, because in your dissertation or your thesis, you have an entire chapter of your results. Those results can be 20, 30, 40 pages in length if you're doing something qualitative. They might only be a couple of pages if you're doing something that's quantitative. But either way, whenever you're submitting this work to an outlet, you have probably A, vastly overwritten your results chapter because your committee is looking for that type of robustness, and B, you're probably answering multiple research questions or research purposes, or addressing multiple hypotheses, all of which cannot appear in the limited space that you have for a single journal article. Instead, you're going to have to be breaking that stuff up. And so you should be thinking to yourself, which parts of my results can I have for my different research questions, research purpose, or hypotheses? How can I parse that data into these different buckets? So that way, whenever I'm post-defense, I can already start to think about how I'm going to pop that back into those different outlines that I might have for the multiple journal articles that I want to go to. The final step is to rewrite your discussion section. So as you're looking at your discussion section, much like your results, you might have 20, 30, 40 pages of discussion there. You might have multiple projects worth of discussion going on. Here, it's more important for you to address your discussion to the specific research questions, purpose, or hypotheses, which in turn address specific outlets. As you're going through this, what you should be doing from the very beginning is developing an outline for each one of the projects that you want to submit as articles, and then start to pull stuff from each one of your different sections, your literature review, your method, your results, your discussion, putting them into those outlines parallel to the outline that you have to your actual dissertation or thesis project. That will allow you to differentiate between that defense mindset, the work that you have to do in order for you to pass that defense, and the pipeline mindset. That is the mindset that you have to have that this project should not die at the defense. Instead, it should continue on, but now having to live in a different type of way. Overall, what I would say is that whenever I very first got at my current institution, there was a guy that would walk around. He'd probably been here, 20, 25 years, never published anything. Whenever you talk to him about scholarship, the only thing that he would ever talk about was his dissertation that he had written 25 years ago. Whenever he did that, of course, everyone kind of rolled their eyes like, oh, God. And certainly I did. I mean, you think about the difference in expectations for scholarly productivity for scholars of this generation as opposed to those who got hired 20, 25 years ago. I mean, it's just night and day, right? Like the amount of work that we are expected to produce is just exponentially more. And yet here's this guy who's never published anything other than the dissertation that he wrote 25 years ago. And honestly, and like I said, every time that he brought this up, people would roll their eyes. And honestly, that is absolutely merited. If you've written your dissertation in particular, thesis, it's a little bit different. But if you're writing your dissertation and then after that dissertation, you never publish anything off of it, that was an egregious waste of your time. You should be using that project to springboard your scholarly trajectory over the course of your life. That is not to say that things that happened in your dissertation should have a one-to-one creation of a project. That's not necessarily the case, as we've been talking about here. A lot of the work that you're going to be doing in your dissertation is going to be converted and stripped out and put into a different format in order for it to have the specificity and uniqueness necessary for it to get published as a journal article. But if you are writing a dissertation and then that's the only time that you've quote unquote published something, and honestly, I even hesitate to even call it that because at this point, the dissertation is not peer reviewed in the same way that an article is. And so calling it a publication, I think, is a little bit of a misnomer. But if that's the only thing that you ever publish, that is a waste of your talent and your potential because you should be taking that work and taking it further. If you're doing a thesis, I think there's less of an expectation for that to happen. But I also think that even that is changing in a lot of ways. I see a lot of people, at least in my field, who are doing work at the thesis level who eventually go on and get that work published. Now, it may not be a publication in a top tier journal. oftentimes isn't. It's a lower tier journal, maybe a book chapter in an edited volume, but it's taken somewhere else beyond just it gathering dust in your college or your university library or hosted on some library website that no one accesses. Instead, it is put into a place where it can add to the conversations that other scholars are having. So I would encourage you, from the very beginning, you should be thinking as your thesis and your dissertation project of how can I take this work and move beyond this particular defense, move beyond this particular project, and take this somewhere else. Okay? So that's about going to wrap it up for me, folks. I appreciate you all listening to the past 10 episodes for Theses and Dissertations. My next episode is going to be on developing a book proposal. I'm actually pretty excited. A colleague and I just submitted all of the chapters to an edited handbook that we've been putting together for Wiley Publishing. And so super excited for that to come out. I think that's going to come out later this year. But I would like to take the time to talk a little bit about that process, about how to land that contract, what the expectations are, and stuff like that. So that way, if you are interested in doing that type of work, then you have a good idea of what you're getting yourself into. Okay? And we'll talk about it both in terms of authored monographs and edited collections. Okay? So thank you so much, and I will see you in next week's episode.
Hey, co-authors, what's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant research shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. You can support this podcast by subscribing to it, leaving a positive review, assigning it to your classes, or sharing it with a colleague. Let me know what I can do to make this the best podcast resource for you. And if you'd like to know more about my writing coach services, then you can find my information in the podcast description and set up an appointment. I'll be back next week with another episode. But until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.